As you probably know, I'm a gamer. It's like my only personality trait, so it should be pretty obvious. I've been playing video games since I was a small child growing up in the 90s. Many popular franchises from that era were my bread and butter back then, and one could argue they frame the way I see modern gaming, which is badly. There's a lot more nuance to my argument here, like for instance, limitations on creativity often force an artist to become more creative. The limitations of technology back then caused game devs to pull all kinds of trick out of their asses in order to serve us an enjoyable, immersive experience. Because of my love for video games and my constant disappointment with modern AAA games, I'm always equally surprised and excited when I find a modern game that goes above and beyond with its storytelling. I am most especially impressed when a game manages to handle the subject of mental illness much, much better than other forms of media, such as movies and television shows. When it premiered, I watched the first season of 13 Reasons Why. Other than how terribly written it was, I also took note of how badly it mishandled the subject of mental health. Telling people that if we were just nicer to the mentally ill, they'd not self-delete is bullshit and a total fucked message. Furthermore, I don't remember the first season mentioning mental illness regarding Hannah, the character who killed herself, something that makes no sense. Suicide is often called the final symptom of untreated mental illness. It is almost always a result of this. To make a show based entirely around a person's suicide and not mention this is ridiculous. I remember watching countless YouTubers explain why this show sucked donkey balls. One in particular said something along the lines of, "There is art made for the mentally ill and art that is made about the mentally ill." Very often, movies and books about the mentally ill are written by the non-mentally ill and give us a perspective from the outside in. And many mentally ill people, including myself, will tell you this perspective is often off or wrong in some way. It's never quite accurate. You get used to this after a while. After all, using mental illness as a plot point is kind of like everywhere. I have a severe mental illness, schizoaffective disorder. Most people haven't heard of it, but it's a combination of schizophrenia and mood disorder symptoms, or as I like to say, it is the best of both fucked up worlds. Naturally, I am hyper aware when I come across media that uses psychosis as a lens to tell its story, and believe me, it's common. Same thing with dissociative identity disorder or dissociative trauma. Shows, games, and movies use these disorders often for entertainment value. Like the show Undone is a very good example of this. It's a great show, but it's definitely not for me. Not only did the show trigger me a bit, gee, I wonder why, but it also hit a nerve, a sore one. That same nerve has been hit over and over again throughout the years by media glorifying psychosis and acting as though it's some sort of blessing in disguise. Many of these works gloss over how these things ruin your life in some of the worst ways. In fact, they usually play it quite safe in that department so as not to make the character unlikable, something else that rubs me the wrong way. They either depict the severely mentally ill as horrific and irredeemable or angelic and misunderstood. It's like, bro, is a nuanced portrayal that hard? I once read an opinion piece that claimed work turning symptoms of psychosis and mental illness in general into a supernatural occurrence reduces the suffering to a triviality, something I don't necessarily agree with, though I get why someone would eventually get to the point of thinking that. After years of seeing their symptoms turned into magic, sometimes being glorified and romanticized, the writer of this piece probably hit the enough is enough wall. I thoroughly enjoyed Donnie Darko, another movie that takes symptoms of psychosis and depicts them as something more supernatural. But Donnie Darko is a good movie, and not only that, it shows a supportive family unit. My favorite line in this movie is when Donnie asks his mom what it feels like having a nut job for a son, and she says, "It feels wonderful." I'm not saying writers and creators shouldn't depict mental illness, and that isn't what my argument is. In fact, I don't have an argument. I'm simply saying that as a person with psychosis, I notice when psychosis is used in media, and I especially notice when it is used in a horrendous, almost offensive manner. Works like 2019's Joker, which I almost walked out of the theaters on because it shook me so hard, depict the realities of mental illness, the harsh truth, the isolation, the sometimes erratic and irrational behavior, and it does it earnestly, showing you exactly what it is like to live with this battle day in and day out. In Downfall, Joe is a controlling monster, but the game doesn't forget to tell you just how he got that way. In Neon Genesis Evangelion, the three main characters are up against extinction-level problems, literally, and each of them has a distinct way of dealing with the situation and their pasts. Asuka resembles a narcissist, Rei doesn't think her existence or identity matters, and Shinji pulls away and isolates as a coping mechanism. And again, the anime does a good job of showing what made them this way. The entire thing isn't nearly as complicated as people want to make it. It's basically 26 episodes saying, it's okay for you to be here. Mental illness is commonly portrayed in media, and it is often mishandled. 13 Reasons Why is a disgrace for many more than 13 reasons, not the least of which is how its first season handled mental illness and suicide. And for those of you who don't know, the first season originally showed Hannah taking her own life. In fact, it showed her getting the tools for the job and then going through with it. It truly astonished me that this got through all the writers and filmmakers and tests and focus groups and whatever. Like nobody said, guys, this is dog shit. Sometimes I am impressed by how a piece of work handles mental illness. These stories manage to be both creative and honest, they're emotionally raw, and do not hesitate to depict the reality of being a prisoner in your own mind. As I mentioned earlier, The Joker with Joaquin Phoenix is a wonderful example of this. When I went to see the movie, I had no idea how much I would relate to this iteration of Joker. From his symptoms to how the system treated him, every second of this movie hurt. There is a scene early on with what has become somewhat of an infamous quote online. The worst part about having a mental illness is people expect you to behave as if you don't. This Joker's depiction of schizophrenic symptoms was too real, and that quote is what made me almost walk out of the theater. Somehow, I buckled down and fought through my sensitivities, staying for the rest of the film, something I'm glad I did. But I still think of scenes in that movie and feel uneasy. It was like watching myself at times. And no, I don't mean that in a, oh my god, he's literally me kind of way. I mean it because the character and I share symptoms, a despondent outlook, and isolation. Joker is a good example of art that is about the disturbed, but not necessarily for us. Like we can consume it, but the messaging behind it isn't for us. It's for the non-mentally ill, the non-disturbed. It's to put them in our shoes and hope it generates empathy from them. 13 Reasons Why is a good example of art that isn't for the disturbed, and it isn't for the non-disturbed either. Like it's just bad art. It is a show about mental illness that doesn't work to say anything meaningful. It's just drama for the sake of ratings and pretending to start a conversation. Many mentally ill people won't like it because it's just a shitty portrayal of mental illness on top of being poorly written, and the non-mentally ill might like it, but they won't learn shit from it. Much like Joker, Hellblade Senua Sacrifice puts you in the shoes of psychosis and doesn't let go. It suffocates you with it. Because it is a video game, the immersion is what sells the experience. Joker was difficult to get through, but Senua's Sacrifice is almost impossible for me to finish. At the time of recording this, I still have not finished the game, but that doesn't matter because I've gotten far enough to be able to talk about what this game does. There won't be any spoilers, just my take on how important of a game Hellblade truly is. The game starts out with Senua rowing a boat as a disembodied voice welcomes you and begins to tell Senua's story, and it was literally right here that I got uncomfortable. Yeah, that's right. Within the first minute of the game, possibly less, I already knew this game was going to do something amazing, something groundbreaking, something that my fragile mind was not going to be able to handle. The game warns you before it starts that if you have symptoms of psychosis, you shouldn't play it. Did I listen? No. Will I ever listen? Also no. The introduction already had me nervous because I immediately recognized the type of voice this was, the storyteller. At least, that's what I call the equivalent of it in my own head. It narrates what I'm doing, tells my story as if it's some dramatic play or book, and talks about the things happening around me. This opening voice implies that the other voices could be dangerous, but what I found most striking is this scene sets the player in the role of a voice in Senua's head, something that became more unnerving as I moved through the game. I considered the fact that I was controlling Senua, and immediately started thinking about what it would be like if a voice in my head took control. No good thoughts extended from this. I am quite prone to becoming overstimulated and having mini breakdowns, sensory overload, basically, and playing this game was about to induce one of these breakdowns within a minute. You'd think I would have stopped playing, but I am not a smart person. Returning to the story, other voices start to cut in, asking questions, inducing anxiety. You can hear some kind of beast breathing. The main voice says the other voices have been around since the tragedy. Some are old, some are new, and mentions the darkness changed some of them. Keep in mind, the game has been on for all of about 2 minutes. The opening credits are still popping up, and I'm already considering turning it off. I played the game for another 15 to 20 minutes before doing exactly that. I wasn't ready. Later that day, I convinced my boyfriend to play it a little bit, just so I could watch him, but like myself, he found the combat clunky, so he didn't want to keep playing. He's not the kind of person who will stick through gameplay he doesn't like for a good story. Obviously, the game impacted me like this because I hear voices, and the way these voices spoke was frighteningly close to how mine spoke. It's hard for me to explain the depth of accuracy here. I do not think that it can be conveyed to those who don't hear voices and experience hallucinations. The voice that narrates the story throughout the game is strikingly close to a voice of mine, one who sits and comments on the goings-on, but is generally neutral. It doesn't hinder or help, it just explains. Down the line, the other voices in the game will help you during battle, telling you when to focus and when the enemy is behind you. They'll also taunt you when you get knocked down, saying things like, "She's not going to make it." Although sometimes they'll encourage, telling you, "Get up, remember your training," and things like that. The voices play a main role in some of the puzzle solving. They'll speak up when you're close to a solution for a certain type of puzzle. You'll also get the aid of visual hallucinations. Something I realized quickly, most of the things in the world around Senua need to be questioned. For instance, the hanging bodies everywhere are likely her hallucinations, just like the colors over runes and doors are not really there either. Senua not being able to open certain doors until she does puzzles, like using her perception to find secret pathways, is all in her head. Those doors were never locked, there were never walls hiding those paths, there was never any magic. It's all a delusion. The mind is a powerful thing, and if you tell yourself you cannot do something and truly believe it, guess what? Your mind will adjust to that. Psychosis follows this rule to a dangerous degree. The other day, a friend of mine asked me if you could hallucinate something in a picture, like if you saw something there, but later looked at a picture taken at the same time, would your hallucination be in it? I explained that sometimes, yes. That is how fucked up and powerful the mind can be. In other cases, you can look at a video or a photo and see that what you thought was there really wasn't. Psychosis plays by its own rules. When I got through the intro of the game, I was greeted with no explanation on how to play whatsoever. No button prompts, no tutorial, nothing. You can pause the game to figure out the controls, but for a moment, it really did feel like the game just didn't give a fuck if I knew how to play it, which, well, that's what the world feels like when you're experiencing psychosis, so fair play to the devs with that one. I doubt the decision to leave the player high and dry was an accident. It seems quite intentional, especially given what else the game throws at you. Immediately, the voices started playing on what I assume is Senua's fears, and also my own fears. An example, when I jumped off a short cliff, one of the voices went, "Now you can't get back up," and some of them laughed, and I remember one expressing anxiety, exactly how my voices work. And mind you, I was worried about the fact that I probably couldn't get back up after a jump, so the voices commenting on that played even more into the immersion for me. The devs recommended you wear headphones so you could experience what psychosis is like firsthand, and boy, did they do a good job with this. I prefer to play the game without headphones because it's far too intense of an experience with them. I already know what hearing voices is like after all, which again is why the game warned me not to play it. There is a character, Druth, and he is another painfully accurate representation. I myself have a male voice who sort of plays like a father figure at times, comforting me when I'm down, pushing me when I need to get things done. He often fights against the negative voices, telling them they're wrong when they insult me. Druth is someone Senua actually knew in real life. So this is a real person she is hallucinating, which made his presence that much sadder, because I'm pretty sure he died. Prior to purchasing Senua's Sacrifice, I had read about what it was trying to do, and of course, I needed to see if these devs were successful. The devs consulted people who have suffered from psychosis and medical professionals throughout the project, gathering data in order to tweak the visuals and mechanics to a level of accuracy I didn't think was possible. They take what they were told, create something, then go back and show what they had to those they consulted. They'd get feedback, then tweak as necessary. And this is what made Senua's Sacrifice the most triggering game I've ever played. But it's an important one, something I'd recommend to most people because of how powerful it is. The question remains, will I ever finish the game? I'm not sure. I want to, but I also value my mental health and sanity, which, when you've got the disorder I have, sanity is hard to come by. I've experienced a long period of feeling good and controlling my symptoms, but any little thing can trigger them and cause a relapse, which is why I must be careful of the media I consume. As badly as I'd like to know Senua's full story, I also know my limits. The sounds of the voices in-game would make my voices start chattering, repeating what was being said and creating a loop. It was, frankly, insane. Again, this is why the game comes with a strong warning that people who have experienced psychosis should stay away. The way the narrating voice talked about Senua's darkness, which is what they're calling psychosis, gave me a feeling of uneasiness I'd never felt from a game, like a deep pit in my guts. There are plenty of horror games that have terrified me. Hell, I had to get my boyfriend to finish the giant monster baby segment of Resident Evil 8 for me. I've played the first 4 Silent Hills into oblivion. I've played emotionally moving games like Death Stranding and Omori. But the realistic portrayal of, well, the unreal, that is worse than anything I've experienced in a game. Nier Automata gave me an existential crisis. It sent me into so many sob fests throughout. And it is home to one of the saddest and darkest things I've ever come across in a game. But what Senua's Sacrifice did is much different from that. Androids fighting for humankind and crumbling under the weight of their own meaninglessness isn't a real thing. It might be one day, but it isn't now. What those androids go through, the questions they were forced to confront, those are what humans can relate to. But there is a barrier of sanity, knowing what is real and what isn't, between you and the characters. You're an observer. But with Senua's Sacrifice, I wasn't an observer. Not only were my symptoms woven into the mechanics of the game, but the portrayals of the symptoms crept into my reality. My voices began to mimic the voices in the game. I started seeing similar patterns on the walls in my house. My delusional thinking kicked in, where I started thinking all these bad things were going to happen due to something completely unrelated, and I could hear people talking about me outside my house. What I'm trying to say, in so many words, is this game had me fucked from the gate. There was no way I was going to get through this without triggering myself, and I mean really triggering, not just getting upset. Some art is for the mentally ill, some isn't. There was some part of me that felt upset about this game. Essentially, it was about me, but I couldn't play it. In the beginning, I almost felt like I was being made fun of. When the first puzzle had me finding a random pattern to match something Senua was hallucinating on the door, it felt like it was saying, haha, this is how you think, you're so stupid. But that was the wrong way to look at it. I wasn't being made fun of. The symptoms I experienced were being used in a meaningful manner to shed light on what people who suffer from psychosis go through. I had to step back and try to play sane for a moment. How confused must someone who doesn't experience these symptoms be with this puzzle? And this persisted. Every single one of the pattern-finding puzzles was kind of nonsensical. You really were looking for random things in the environment, and sometimes the only thing that made it obvious were the hallucinations that worked to help you. And I realized, yeah, the patterns I notice in the real world probably don't make much sense to others because of the, let's call it my special brand of logic that I use to make those connections. As I said, I still haven't finished this game, though I've re-downloaded it on my PS5 and plan to try again. The game has a tendency to trigger me so much, I kind of rage delete it and tell myself, okay, never again. You don't need to finish a game that upsets you so much. But I'm stubborn, and I really want to experience the story, so I'll re-download it, and then I'll play it, and then I'll get triggered, and then I'll delete it. Sometimes I wonder why I'm not like this with Dark Souls, but that style of gameplay is uneventful. The more I veer into the territory of making commentary videos, the more I realize this channel is just a channel about why art is important. I suppose that is to be expected from someone who has had books and video games teach her important life lessons. I didn't have much of a childhood or a decent connection with the people who raised me. I was forced to learn a lot of things about the world on my own, and art helped me along that journey. I guess it makes sense that I eventually became a writer. All that sadness and disappointment had to be channeled somehow. Senua's Sacrifice is an example of an important piece of art that some would say is more than just a video game. But I'd push back against that, at least a little. What it does is use its format to teach and immerse in ways that other art forms cannot. Like Nier Automata does, it uses gameplay mechanics to say something valuable, to teach the player a profound lesson. Senua's Sacrifice doesn't allow you to ignore or look away from psychosis. The game forces it on you, the way mental illness forces itself onto its victims. In the real world, we can look away from the disabled and the mentally ill. We can pretend they don't exist if we don't have those ailments and don't have anyone around us who does. But in the world of video games, the devs can put you in the shoes of something quite uncomfortable. They can force you to deal with it. Being uneasy, bewildered, overwhelmed, feeling as though you are moving in circles. These aren't bad game design choices. They are deliberate because that is what psychosis is like. The darkness can come at any time, without warning, just like how symptoms of psychosis can intrude upon your life whenever they feel like it. Some art is for the disturbed. I consider Downfall a great example of a game that puts you in the shoes of a monster. It forces you to do terrible things while you take control of Joe Davis, the monster in question. Downfall is for the disturbed, much like the Cat Lady and BoJack Horseman. There is an episode of BoJack Horseman, The View from Halfway Down, and if you've ever seen it, you will completely understand when I say it made me immediately go, I can never take my own life. It isn't worth it. I've also suffered an NDE, an experience that made me realize something beyond the material exists. Many people describe their near-death experiences as positive and completely changing who they are, but I didn't have an experience like that. It was rather uncomfortable and left me shaken. I know we aren't alone, but knowing that means nothing. I find it exceedingly hilarious that confirmation of God's existence has done less for my mental health than cartoons and video games have. Maybe God intended it that way. I don't know, nor do I care. Some art is unforgettable. It confronts the disturbed while it makes the non-disturbed see things they hadn't before, and it can teach the disturbed and non-disturbed alike a lesson or two in the process. But then there is art that just isn't for the disturbed, whether it is god-awful and really just not for anyone with a brain, like 13 Reasons Why, or if it makes a mockery of the suffering the mentally ill live through every day, like Undone. And I know I'm probably going to get shit for that considering it's critically acclaimed, but whatever, who cares? Then there is art that isn't for the disturbed, not because it shitty and poorly represents mental illness, but because it was specifically made to teach a non-disturbed person what living with madness is like. That is what Senua's Sacrifice is. There are plenty of people who suffer from psychosis who played this game just fine and had little to no issues getting through it. There are others who, like me, had it rough and set it down. Some fought through until the end, the way I did with Joker. It all depends on what someone could handle. But every single person I've come across who suffers with psychosis and played Senua's Sacrifice has essentially said the same thing in regard to it. The accuracy is astonishing, something that blew them away within minutes. Sometimes a piece of art leaves us speechless and in awe with what it was able to accomplish. I may never finish Senua's Sacrifice, but I can certainly say that the opening scene, as well as the puzzle sections you must solve to progress, took my breath away. After facing 2 of the bosses and quite a few enemies throughout the game, I truly did feel like I was fighting against my own demons. This video has probably gone on way longer than it should have, and I'm not the best at closing out a video essay or commentary, whatever you want to call it. Like I reiterate in many of my videos, art is the most important human creation because it has the ability to generate large amounts of empathy, to make people more compassionate and kind. It teaches people the experience of others. Art isn't just about how beautiful or expensive it is. It isn't about its monetary value while it collects dust on some rich person's wall. Art isn't defined by how much it costs or shines. It's about the impact it has on the human soul.